I've been dealing with, in a thematic way, I've been using birds, and they're more or less universal type birds. I use them because I'm interested in their patterns and their rhythms, etc. I had a studio downtown, and I would go up to Tar Beach, up on the roof. And on Tar Beach, I'd have my lunch, and I'd bring parts of my lunch would go to birds, and all of a sudden more and more birds were coming around. I never used birds as imagery, but it's like, gee, then you start to have an interest in them, and so the interest goes into studies. When you're looking at something artistic, you're not looking at it necessarily as, oh, here's a full-blown idea. You start to study things. So I was studying things. I was studying birds, and when you're studying birds, you're doing drawings of them, you're doing paintings of them, you're doing small little things, and then it sort of grows from that. It grows into just more and more stuff that you do with them. My name is Daniel V. Burke. I'm a professor of art at Mercyhurst College. And so this is a documentation. I did want to say, but my middle name is V. The V is for Valentine. I was named after my mother's father. It's a strange middle name, so I thought I'd mention that. I think in any endeavor, you're usually encouraged with positive reinforcement. And I think a lot of the positive reinforcement I got toward art was primarily from my mother. Also from my mother's sisters. Whenever you're doing little pictures, making pictures with crayons, marking them, etc., and showing them to people, certain people actually respond always in a positive sort of way, saying, oh my, look how successful that is, etc. And I think that a lot of the encouragement thing, the reason for going into art has to do with positively being reinforced. And it's like you're encouraged then to say, gee, you are actually doing well at this thing, continue doing this thing. And that started at a very early age. It's like preschool. I went to a parochial grade school, and there the encounter was primarily with nuns. And nuns actually populated the whole school situation. But even they were always positive towards artworks. The artworks were rather sort of pedestrian sort of artworks. It's like, gee, let's make some rosaries out of aluminum tinfoil and string. But I can remember making those things. You bring them home, and it was always the mom saying, boy, this is really something. Let's put this up on display. And for college, it was going to the Columbus College of Art and Design, getting a scholarship to go there. The scholarship ran out after 2 years. I found myself in a situation where we didn't have the money to go on to school, and at that time I enlisted in the Army. So I joined the Army, served in the Army for 3 years. That was in the Vietnam era. And so after the Army, I had the GI Bill, and with the GI Bill I was able to go back for my undergraduate degrees and for my graduate degree. I've been doing this for, this is a long time. I look upon it as, the word is a calling. And if it's a calling, they used to use that word in a religious sense. I ended up teaching because someone asked me to teach. I didn't apply for a job or whatever. I ended up, just because of the way things bumped along, ended up going to art school and going to those other things just because it was that way. It wasn't like my parents didn't have a conscious thing about, gee, you should go and do this or anything. It just happened that way. So everything happened for me, fortuitously. I mean, this is really, when I look at teaching as a joyful experience. We're in the Art Lab studio. This is on the second floor of Zurn at Mercyhurst College. And we don't have a class this afternoon, so I decided to put up some pinups. I wanted to talk about exercises that a person would do prior to doing the artwork. So we have various things on display here and down at the far end, and I'll start to go through those. Last summer I was asked by the dance department, the music department, to cooperate with them and to actually do a performance piece where we actually had dance, music, and art involved. So I started to work on some stage type materials. It resulted in the Cavani String Quartet coming to campus and using my works as a backdrop, as stage type things. When I was doing the stage scenes, I started to do them, I was concerned about weight, so I'm working with PVC pipe. These would be all dropped down from the ceiling. And I started to explore something different as far as the materials. Instead of using just paint on canvas, I started to use recycled materials. So the recycled materials I was using were just old garments. In this case, they were a lot of old pants, etc. And they resulted in these tree-type forms. That's all I was doing initially, was taking a simple thing like a pair of pants, inverting them, turning them upside down, where they actually become trunk and two limbs, and then you have the other forms becoming additional sort of limbs. I found that if I actually use zippers and put zippers on them, by unzipping limbs, I would create more limbs. So they went from smaller limbs at the top to larger limbs at the bottom, and I started to assemble them this way so that they're very, very light. They would drop down from the ceiling then. When I started to do these, because they just involved sewing, I wanted to be involved in some art activities with this also, so I started to use and do these type occurrences. When I started to do sketches, I was concerned with the color and how to actually construct these things. And then I started to do something which I refer to as exercises. I don't look at it as an exercise as a study of something, but it gets you into the mood of doing things. So if you look at these are simply, I'm using a format, and on each of these formats, I'm just using rectangles. I'm using gridded paper, creating rectangle shapes, and then filling in the shapes with colored ink. I'm looking for how do shapes react to other shapes, what color combinations might a person use. So if I look at this, what I'm constantly doing is variations. That's all I'm using is a high Renaissance technique for actually filling this in. I'm using, it's not really cross-hatching, it's putting in a natural sort of way. I'm putting in strokes with one sort of diagonal direction. I'm putting in the mark on the downward thrust. And then I'm filling in with a slightly different direction to the stroke so that it doesn't really cross-hatch. It's not going to give me a screen type appearance. Why are you putting down colors in one place rather than another? After a while, it just becomes intuitive. But the intuition is actually predicated on something. It's predicated on you want variety of placement of forms. We're at the far end of the studio now. And these type occurrences, I started to play with dots. And the dots are a substitute for something. These are just stick-ons. And when I'm doing stick-ons, I'm trying to understand patterns which are taking place in birds. If ever you've seen a swarm of birds, it seems like no two, they don't line up or march. They're all in irregular sort of patterns. So to get myself into the mode of irregular patterns, I'm just playing with dots on a gridded surface again. And the goal in doing these is to actually just put together something which appears to be more natural. They're naturalistic sort of formations. No two dots are exactly the same distance apart, so I'm concerned with negative spaces between things. It's probably the same thing that happens on a wonderful starry night. If you look at stars, they would have the same sort of a placement. If you look at placement of things, there's no repetition. There's no lining them up as soldiers. The distance between things would always be the same. And this is exercise then. In other words, as I do these things, the next step, when these become birds on the wall, or they become birds in subject matter in paintings or whatever, at that time, I'll be sensitized to it. I've done, literally hundreds of these already. Every time you're approaching this, it ends up different. Art has a lot to do with practice. I can't remember what book it's in. I think it may be The Outliers sort of thing, or it maybe has to do with, to become expert at something, you have to put in 10,000 hours. And so it doesn't matter whatever your discipline is. In other words, if you're a hockey player, sorry, it's going to take you 10,000 hours before you know what the hell you're doing and what this whole area is about. It's practice at something. There's a lot of work involved in art that people don't think of. And if you really think about when does the intuition take place, when does the idea take place, etc., that's not as crucial as that 95% of the time, which is just work. It's just getting into this zone and being able to do this thing. Normally this is something I recommend to everyone, really. It's like you have to sleep on things. Your unconscious will act with it. And when you're sleeping on things artistically in the studio, normally you're finished with the work and the work doesn't go to the public, or other people are not really seeing it until it's exhibited somewhere. And normally a good framework is like maybe 6 months or something. You've lived with this thing for 6 months. I know that with a lot of my work, I've had works that I've been actually playing on, cutting apart, putting back together, etc., for 10 or 20 years. I mean, they really have a lot of stuff. They went through changes, and they're going through the changes that you go through. So the key ingredient is, when it's done for itself. You're looking at this thing, and it's like, the question is, you want to be open to the work, and the work is telling you what does it need rather than what you need. The woodworking, I don't do, there are things, you need a compound miter saw, and you need a sanding application, and a lot of the stuff I do by hand. I tried doing things with a jigsaw, and it wasn't fast enough. So I ended up, when I'm cutting out objects, I use a saber saw, which is that reciprocating just jigsaw. And that, I'd love to figure it out someday, but I bet I've been around the world as far as how many miles I've actually cut. That hasn't been, I've only been doing that for the last maybe 10 years or so. And I don't do it as craftsmanship with wood. In other words, I don't consider myself a woodworker per se or anything like that. I do it in a very functional sort of way. So I'd want to, in the things that I cut out, when I'm making mistakes cutting out, I'll actually use that stuff. It's like, gee, here's the mistake in cutting it out. I like for people to be able to see the process of doing something. If I'm sewing something, it's not with the perfect amount of threads or anything. It's in a functional sort of way. Let's adhere these two things together using thread. And these are all cut out just with a saber saw. Ooh, rib cage. So you never know when you'll need a rib cage. Sorry. Mirrors. It's actually going to be fun to go through all this to find all these different things, because they actually may stimulate some thoughts for some different ideas. The advantages of teaching at a college, and especially at a college that is supportive. I was thinking back, I've actually served under 5 presidents. I'm a full professor, so I've been a professor for 28 years. Last year I became a research fellow, and that allows me extra time to actually pursue the art thing. I think as far as the presidents that we've had, and the whole institution has really been positive towards art and the fine arts component of what college life is about. So it's been always very, very supportive here. If you are a college teacher, I think no matter what discipline that you're in, it is also incumbent on you to remain current, so that education really doesn't really stop and you are current with what's happening in the world. I think you have to get people interested or involved in something at a very early level. So it's like I've always been, when I have shows, whenever they can plan something where elementary kids can come in and you can talk to them, that's crucial. And I think it's crucial because they are super perceptive. They don't have a lot of biases, etc., so that they can see things in a very open way. In other words, they're open to this experience of art. Photograph it during the year. So it'd be, here's this branch, how it would look in the spring, how it would look in the fall, how it would look in the winter. But I haven't done that yet. But I still have the branch. And it's drying out. It's dried now.